Hey there guys, it's Metro and welcome to the healing spec tier list for Mythic Plus dungeons made specifically for patch 7.3.5. In this video we will be ranking healers based on their ability to impact 5-man groups while making direct comparisons between all the healing options. It is purely made up of my opinions, formulated from thousands of Mythic Plus runs as well as information from the recent Mythic Plus Dungeon Invitational and parsing sites like WoW Progress and Warcraft Log. We are making this now especially as patch 7.3.5 has dramatically altered the ability to stack battle reses and use them to circumvent mistakes and other difficulty. By my approximation, this will shift the meta even further towards certain specs and classes that have some significant group-wide survival impact or other strong defensive options. For this tier list, the most obvious discussion will of course be the healing the slot can provide, but as many things are equally capable in 2018, it will be instead pertinent to compare each other along these lines. Number 1, their bulk, ability to survive and help others survive dangerous mechanics. Number 2, their ability to provide meaningful damage to the group and do so without significantly hindering their healing capabilities. And number 3, their group-wide utility and how important it might be for the success of the group. So with all that aside, let's get right into the list. Tier 1, number 1 is Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin has been and will continue to be an incredibly well-rounded addition to any dungeon group, and many of their strengths lie in their ability to quickly snap health bars up to full. When looking at raw healing alone, you see a very clear picture. Holy Paladin reigns as the greatest healer for healing a single target outright. This is of course not all that matters in 5-mans, but thanks to a very generous talent tree and beacon of virtue, many of the flaws you might expect them to have with group-wide healing are erased. Paladin's ability to quickly heal the group is enough to make them an all-star, but their true strength also comes from other categories. In terms of damage, they have an incredibly powerful niche to the point of out-DPSing actual damage dealers when CDs are up on single target. The hugely potent single target has potential to make fights significantly shorter and works very well on fortified weeks when you know your group members aren't going to be in immediate danger on the pull. Their AoE, on the other hand, isn't anything to write home about, but they do have the luxury of placing Consecrate with one global and letting it tick out as they continue healing, however, don't have enormous potential outside of that. The bulk that a Paladin presents is yet another reason to consider them for all content. Holy Paladin has been gifted a very large health pool in Legion thanks to spells that presumably are meant to drain your health, but are rarely a concern in 5-mans. This alone is something many specs would dream about, but they also have a 20% reduction on a short CD as well as a flat-out immunity, both of which can be further reduced by the Unbreakable Spirit talent, although this does come at the cost of some mobility, as was mentioned in the ret discussion. On top of this, they can also use Devotion Aura to their extreme benefit if done right, allowing for another large passive reduction. Combining all of this with the typical Pride's usage makes for an absolute juggernaut that should only see their health challenged by the most dangerous of mechanics. In the past, their one stumbling point would have been utility, but thanks to the recent meta shifts, abilities like Sack, Freedom, and Bop will have even more usefulness than in the past. Outside of these spells, they don't bring much else. However, a single target stun and the possibility of a hard CC or AoE interrupt can be a nice way to round out their kit. Devotion Aura can also be looked at as a form of utility, and while many will use its effects to offer more healing or a large group-wide reduction, the passive element can add up to a significant portion of damage reduced over the course of 30-plus minute dungeons, especially when monitoring the range properly. When looking at the total package of Holy Paladin, it's very difficult to not see tremendous upsides. Their damage alone really stands out as an outlier and doesn't require crazy investment like some other specs. Their bulk can be extreme, and they are the only healer with an immunity. They provide utility that can save multiple types of deaths and do all of this while benefiting hugely from the crit levels and Beacon of Virtue to quickly top anyone off without worry, making them comfortably the number 1 overall healer for all types of Mythic Plus 5-man content. Tier 1, number 2 is Resto Druid. Really, if there was a better way to indicate a tie in a tier list, I would be open to the possibility of saying Resto Druid is capable of sharing the top spot. When compared to Holy Paladin, you actually see a serious amount of similarities despite their healing kit and playstyle varying so heavily. If you have done 5-mans at all before a Legion, you would know that the healing over time model makes them extremely capable. Really, what this allows for is extreme mobility and flexibility, and this is the one area where they might actually have an edge on Paladin. When examining their defense defensive capabilities, they also have quite a unique kit. If you watch my DPS tier list, you will recognize many of the features from the Bombkin section, but this time we will be more plain when discussing the Displacer Beast talent. The talent, albeit typically looked at as a mobility option, is actually one of the best defensive options in the game, thanks to the mechanical shift in Legion dungeons that makes mechanics target the ground underneath you instead of you directly. This allows you to blink out of mechanics that otherwise shouldn't be dodgeable and should make for a significant portion of the mechanical requirements on the encounter. They of course also have access to bark skin and bear form, which alone would make them insanely bulky. If you watch any top level Mythic Plus run with a druid, you will see just how overpowered bear form can be, and as it's essentially usable constantly, it's difficult to compare directly to paladins, but still very clearly overpowered. In terms of damage, you see a similar story. They have cat affinity and multiple dots that make for a lot of management but extreme potential, although truly maximizing your damage will require legendaries from specs other than Resto, including Bombkin Shoulders and Guardian Cloak. They likely won't do as much as Paladin without these items and a significant investment into trinkets and stats, but that's what makes it difficult to judge accurately. And once you do have a committed set, you'll truly be bringing a ton of damage, especially on any situation where you could make use of multiple dots. Unfortunately, the reason I am confident they are behind Paladin is the fall of their utility. Realistically, the one utility they bring is Ursul's plus knockback and then battle res. After these changes, you want your battle res to be on a slot that will be the bulkiest, so that does help Resto's case, but overall being the only healer with battle res simply becomes less important. This leaves knockback and Ursul's as the only real utility they bring, and while the combination can be potent as a way to grip mobs together, it's mostly used for its ability to AoE interrupt, and there are other options other healers have that can work just as well if not better as an AoE interrupt. Druids do also still have Root, which has some nice usages, including using it as a form of hard CC in some dungeons. In the end, examining Resto Druids shows extreme flexibility in the face of any danger a healer might face. You want your healer to be able to handle any surprises or mistakes that might come, and this may be the thing that Resto Druid does best. This flexibility in healing and survival leaves them in a very good place, and even though their damage requires extreme commitment, it can be very powerful and very exciting when used properly. This summary is precisely why Druid is the tried and tested number 2 overall. Tier 1 number 3 is Resto Shaman. Typically, I would break these lists down into 3 tiers with 2 slots each, but I wanted to make a clear distinction here by saying Shaman is a cut above, yet still behind Druid. When I first considered the changes being made to battle res and dungeons in general, I had actually thought of placing Shaman in the second spot, but in the end they do carry a few big flaws that will hurt them overall. Their healing model especially can be very strong, but ultimately it is tough to compare it to Paladins and Druids favorably. Theirs seems to cater more to situations that might happen in a raid instead of 5-mans, like AoE healing or healing multiple people when they are all low health but still in comfortable health range. But the Tidal Wave passive, plus how their mana management works, can still make them very capable in 5-man dungeons. Realistically, the major reason I was ever considering Shaman a top healer is because of their utility. In a world where healers pack very little options, many Shamans really take your breath away. Even without the rest, the fact that they are the only healer with an actual interrupt and it being on such a short CD and usable at range can easily make them top of the utility pile. As there are so many options, the best way to approach them all will simply be to list them and add my commentary. Spirit Link Totem. While not truly utility, this ability acts as the single strongest defensive ability in the entire game for 5-mans, and assures no person can die while standing in it with multiple other players. Ancestral Protection Totem. This totem can be used to outright prevent death, effectively circumventing the loss of battle reses in Mythic Plus dungeons. Windrush Totem. Likely not used by every shaman, but the only group-based speed functionality in the game that's available to healers. Bloodlust. Obviously extremely useful, but many groups get by simply with just drums. Still, it's better than drums and very valuable as the only healer who can bring it. Lightning Surge Totem. One of 2 AoE stun options as a healer and is able to be thrown down at range and does not require playing a monk. Earthbind Totem. Not the best slow in the game, but without much effort you can significantly help your group on affixes like Skittish or Necrotic. It is the only real AoE slow available to healers. Hex. One of few hard CC available among healers, but not hugely useful. Purge. One of 2 spells available to healers that can remove deadly debuffs, but niche usages still. Regardless, it can still be valuable as many of these would be on the healer to make up for anyway. Water Walking. Extremely seldomly used, but may still find some value in select dungeons. And Astral Recall. Second Hearth can actually be very useful if accidentally finding yourself in a group with people from Ragnaros or Azralon. Hopefully this list helps exemplify exemplify why Shaman can be so strong, and considering they have interrupts and AoE stuns, they can prevent a lot of damage without actually having to heal it. Even though their utility brings insane value, their bulk can be worth discussing too. Realistically, they only have one defensive option, which heavily sets them apart from the top two. Astral Shift is their lone CD, but it's actually the strongest of all CDs, seeing a 40% reduction but on a 1.5 minute CD. Realistically, the main thing that keeps people from completing the hardest keys are abilities that some classes can survive but others can't, and this is a significant knock against Shaman, but it is an equal knock against everyone else lower. Either way, something worth discussing is them having Ankh and the potential to again save an entire res if they die, but unfortunately this feels like it's a part of their defensive kit, making it difficult to properly discuss. One thing that does need to be discussed is their ability to dodge abilities, similar to how Resto Druid can do it with Blink. They can use the Gust of Wind talent to quickly get out of the way of some of these abilities, but it requires significantly better reaction time and won't work unless you are max range on many mechanics. This is also in direct competition for the Windrush totem, but you can get used to using this well. It adds a very important layer to their defense and can easily be worth losing the group speed and higher keys just to survive. More so, maybe their worst element will be their damage. They have a very limited DPS kit and their only multi-target damage is Chain Lightning, which only affects 3 total targets. This leaves them on the outside looking in on the large group AoE people playing Druid will shine on, but Chain Lightning does do significant damage, and if you get an LE legendary or 2, can equate to some very capable damage on small packs. In terms of single target though, they have a fairly interesting situation where they can keep up Flame Shock and then just fire off free lava bursts, but again, when actually trying to do damage, they will struggle to stand up to other healers. So after all that discussion on their shortcomings, it should really show you how valuable I find their utility and capability to prevent deaths. Truly, Shaman's utility kit is in a league of its own and will absolutely have a massive influence on the dungeon. Some may disagree that this influence is worth the other downsides, but I feel it comfortably places them well above the rest, but still also comfortably lower than Druid and Paladin. Tier 2 number 1 is Discipline Priest. In the last healer tier list I made, I was admittedly overly unfair to Discipline. I spoke very critically of a few of their segments, but most of my distaste came from what could have been, as I was extremely excited to see Disc back in the top of 5-man dungeons after the WoD debacle. Unfortunately, this hasn't been the case, but luckily, thanks to the Battle Res change, they will again be trending upwards. Truly, the Discipline model actually plays perfectly into what is needed now. They are the only healer that can add effective health to the group right now, thanks to the plethora of shielding options they possess, and this alone can make them quite capable. Especially when considering Power Word Barrier and its many buffs throughout the expansion, this should be perfectly capable of making up for those times when players don't have a CD and might die to an unmitigated hit. Unfortunately, the same reason they are good at keeping others alive ends up leaving Blizzard to create a shortcoming for their own survival. Really, Discipline has no actual defensive CD. Luckily, the artifact grants them a percentage reduction attached to Fade, which is on a very short CD, meaning that if you have multiple points into this trait, you could potentially have the most effective CD of all healers. But how realistic is that? It seems they expect you to simply shield yourself, and given the playstyle, this seems perfectly logical, but in practicality, it seems very unreliable and strikes me as significantly weaker than all but one other spec. Things don't get any better from here on either, and the utility story for Disc is an equally confusing and sad one. Just like the discussion in the Shadow portion of the DPS tier list, Priest actually brings quite a few different utilities to the dungeon, but almost none of them have any impact whatsoever. Before we go on listing them again, I will say that it's only fair to equate Barrier and their shielding to utility if we are going to do the same for Shaman and Paladin, so that will keep them a notch above those below, but still the remainder of what they bring is begging for a rework. Shackle Undead. Probably the most useful, and that is really saying something. 3 other healers bring a better hard CC, but this one is specifically for Undead, which does give it a nice little niche. Mass Dispel is the other semi-useful option, and after months of asking this question, I can never get any specific usages past dispelling things that just do damage outside of Eye. Realistically, the spell is just not needed, as almost no debuffs persist that must be dispelled immediately and go on multiple people at once, but for the few that might exist, it's certainly beneficial for the healer to do so this kind of works out. Psychic Scream. Seems like a decent way to proc Cephas, but otherwise only useful as an AoE interrupt, something that other healers simply have better access to. Dispel Magic. Identical to Shamans, and existing on a much worse utility kit. Leap of Faith. No discernible niche I am aware of. There was great usage for it, allowing skips in WoD TMs, so I'm sure there must be something you can skip with it. Mind control. Again, something that used to be very useful, as you could run mobs off places they wouldn't be able to return from, but I am unaware of any place it can be used in dungeons today. Angelic Feathers. Used to be the crown jewel of Priest and Mop and suffered 2 crippling nerfs in 2 back-to-back expansions, now leaving them as only a 40% speed buff on a 3-charge 30-second CD. It's useful, but people approach dungeons differently, and this type of continuous speed is no longer needed. And finally, Shining Force, a knockback which is of course very useful for some of the easiest weeks containing Sanguine, but has to be targeted on a player, meaning it will very often knock mobs in random directions, equating to a sizable DPS loss instead of a quick movement out of a blood puddle. It should also be noted that they have the single strongest external CD in the game in Pain Suppression, but on the longest CD, meaning select big plays may happen, but they will be few and far between when compared to an ability like Ironbark. And the last thing to discuss as disc is their damage, or perhaps lack thereof. When examining the kit, you would expect Discipline to be a very capable damage dealer, and no doubt many will come in here pleading their case as to why they are, but in truth they are average at best if not below. The entire idea of them doing damage to heal has effectively been neutered beyond belief compared to how they played in MOP, where they could easily outdamage actual damage dealers all while healing everyone. If they were capable of this again in Legion, Disc would again end up in a very desirable spot, but when you compare the damage they do to Druid or Paladin, you cannot help but be disappointed, especially when you consider they have no actual AoE damage whatsoever outside of simply spreading dots to multiple targets. In my opinion, the Legion Discipline Priest model has been a true flop for 5-mans, where it had such great potential in concept. They really are suffocated by a lack of AoE DPS and any meaningful utility, but even after saying this, I am still ranking them 4th overall. I hope this can sink in and allow you to realize just how much value I have on having a strong defensive focused kit, and even though their personal kit isn't massive, the effective health they can regularly lend to party members will surely add up on dangerous dungeons as you get through higher and higher keys. Tier 2, number 2 is Holy Priest. It's best to attempt to compare Holy to Disc as we did in the DPS tier list, as they are both within the same class and must be able to provide meaningful niches in order for them to both be competitive. Luckily, this is the case with Holy and Disc, and Holy specifically carries with it the yin to Disc's yang for most of their faults. In terms of raw throughput, Holy actually has insane upside. They likely may be true rivals to Holy Paladin in terms of sheer burst, but ultimately are just a weaker version of Resto Druid in all other elements. Still, like Resto Druid, they bring incredibly valuable damage, and unlike Discipline, this will come in the form of AoE. They have a strong single target combination with Holy Fire as a dot, but where they really shine will be thanks to Holy Nova doing as much AoE damage as it does. I find them to be true rivals to Druids in terms of AoE damage, but unfortunately there are no legendaries or items to specifically augment their damage, as they don't share spells like this with other specs. Unfortunately, their downsides are clear in their survival. They are the only healer without a percent-wide defensive option, and this is a very odd thing in 2018. Instead, they have Desperate Prayer, which is almost an ironic name, as when you use it, you are likely desperately praying Blizzard to get their heads together on the Priest defensive kit. Instead of reducing damage, it instead heals you for a significant amount and increases your health by 30%, but that decays over time every 2 seconds. This gives them, on average, about the same health as a Holy Paladin, but the heal itself feels very useless in Mythic Plus, as you will often come to a mechanic that you simply can't survive and need every point of reduction you can muster. That aside, their Legion-specific stuff does grant them some interesting options. They have a legendary cloak that will resurrect them after spirit form goes off, meaning they effectively have an Ankh, but it is tied to a legendary instead of just a CD, and as mentioned prior, makes me think Blizzard intentionally ties this into the defensive elements they seem to lack. They also have a single point trait that allows the priest to put Guardian Spirit on both a target and themselves, which will likely be your best chance at surviving, but realistically is a relatively poor value for their only external unless you are sure you and someone else will die without it, which of course does occur. It's also worth noting that many abilities are physical, and as the only cloth wearer, they will take slightly more damage naturally, although this hasn't been as important as other factors in recent years. Finally, their utility is essentially identical to Disc, minus the discussion about absorbs, but they also have one nice addition, that being the Censure talent. This comes at the cost of Shining Force, but provides a stun on top of the typical usage of Chastise. This can be very useful in many dungeons, and allows for a nice extra spot of utility, although doesn't improve their kit much overall. In summation, the Holy Priest brings extremely good healing and high burst throughput, as well as very valuable AoE damage, making them slightly resembling Holy Paladin or Druid. Unfortunately, where the comparison ends is the utility, and especially the defensive elements, both of which Priest in general are severely lacking on. If it wasn't for Cloak and the artifact trait, Holy Priest would be unbelievably defenseless, leaving me very worried about what things are going to be looking like in Battle for Azeroth. And finally, Tier 3, number 1. Number 6 overall is Mistweaver Monk. Before we begin with this, I want to elucidate the decision on making a third tier with only a single slot. I think breaking things down this way paints a clearer picture. Just like I find Resto Shaman significantly better than Priest, but still worse than Druid, I find pretty much all healers significantly better than Monk, so much so that they do not deserve a peer in the tier. Now, it's easy to say Monk is the worst option for 5-mans, as they are demonstrably the least represented in all the competitive circles, but at least for me, it's particularly difficult to pinpoint exactly why this is the case. When we made the last tier list on healers, I focused a lot of my discussion on Monk healing and HPS outright. To this day, I stand by my statement that they lack both the consistent throughput a Resto Druid would have and the burst a Paladin or Holy Priest might have. Really, the biggest problem with the kit is that it seems perfectly tailored to raid healing, but contains nothing specific to 5-mans like Wild Growth or Beacon of Virtue. The best way we can illustrate this is by trying to compare them one-to-one with other healers. They have a lot of healing over time options, but lack the potency to be compared to a Resto Druid. They have some sizable single target throughput thanks to Enveloping Mist and Effuse, but not strong enough to be compared to Holy Paladin or Holy Priest. Vivify seems like a good heal for 5-mans as it heals 3 players, but compared to Wild Growth and the plethora of options Priest and Shaman have, does it actually stand up? Chi Burst offers some nice burst healing as an option and might patch a few holes in their kit, but how does it compare to a Holy Shock into Virtue? Shay Lun's Gift is a heal that everyone raves about as one of the strongest spot heals in the game, but can it compare to Holy Word Serenity or Crit Holy Shock, especially as it's on a 2-second cast time? They also have Thunder Focus T, which is a short CD ability that heavily affects the usage of 1 to 3 spells, but again, feels like a weaker version of a CD like Wings as it only affects single casts at a time. They have, of course, still Life Cocoon, which thanks to a couple artifact traits, absorbs damage and acts as a heavy healing CD to a single target, but without traits to reduce its CD, it feels less effective outright than abilities like Pain Suppression or Barkskin, and marks their only defensive element on their entire kit, where healers like Disciplined Priest, Holy Paladin, and Resto Shaman all contain multiple. Overall, we are discussing healing more than most because I have to believe this is the real reason Monk is the least represented in 5-mans at the moment. They really feel like a class designed around raid healing, and honestly get very strong when they have more targets to heal, but I can't help but feel they simply do less healing than everyone else in 5-mans. This, of course, isn't their only weakness. In terms of damage, they resemble a weaker Holy Priest to me. Because of how Teachings of the Monastery work, they seemingly will be looking to reset CDs on single target, just like a Holy Priest, but ultimately their spells don't deal any more damage. In terms of AoE, they have Spinning Crane Kick, which is similar in scope to Holy Nova, but certainly does not do more damage, and requires you to channel it, making it a heavier commitment for less results. All of these abilities do require melee as well, which is probably the biggest problem entirely for this class, but they do still have Crackling Jade Lightning for some extra range damage if needed. From a utility standpoint, they too have very little, but certainly are stronger than Priests. They have a similar talent tier to Brewmaster Monk in that Ring of Peace and Leg Sweep are both incredibly strong, but share exclusivity. Again, if there was a way to have both, it would be very strong. They also have Song of Chi-Ji on that tier, which I don't believe I have ever seen used effectively, but it does strike me as interesting, although weaker than Leg Sweep in conceivable situations. It is a powerful thing to have an AoE stun as a healer, but it does require melee range, simply making it inferior to Shaman, who have a much more dynamic utility kit as it is. Other than that, their main utility remains to be Tiger's Lust, which gives a 70% speed boost to a target on a 30-second CD. The distinct drawback here is that it is talented on the same tier as an important movement abilities for the Mistweaver, but as a concession, it also acts as a freedom. Overall, less impressive than Shaman in terms of speed, and less useful as a root break than actual freedom. The only other utility they appear to have is a slow aura around their Transcendence Ghost, which may have some usage in certain affixes, but again seems to be very difficult to use on average. And of course, they also still have Paralysis, which works well as an in-combat CC, but doesn't function significantly better than any other option out there, and is something that is usually doubled up on from the DPS slots in your group. In terms of survival, luckily they are average. They have an entire tier dedicated to survival, which is obviously better than Priest, and have Fortifying Brew, which gives 20% more health and reduces 20% of damage for less time than other healers on a 1.5 minute CD. This is the same CD Astral Shift has, but it's difficult to compare it if the 20% health is actually more effective than another 20% reduction. Overall, I would prefer the shortest CD possible, but they can also take Dampen Harm for an additional 20 to 50% reduction on a 2-minute CD, where the reduction depends on the incoming damage, and as discussed in the Windwalker discussion on the DPS tier list, this can range from the best CD in the game to a below average one based on the encounter. Realistically, the strength of the Monk class is its mobility, but I have gone away from discussing this in the healer tier list, as compared to tanks and DPS, no healer has any hugely unique mobility worth bringing up. If I were to rate for this, Monk is obviously the second most mobile, and this may help them in terms of their melee range requirement for damage and healing, but overall does little to influence my thoughts on the matter. In the end, I can't help but feel they are overly complex compared to other healers as well. When I examine their kit, I worry that the main reason you see them be so ineffective is because there are so many variables to their actual healing model. And while a skilled healer might be able to maximize this, on average, more complexity means less damage and focus on mechanic. When talking about healers as a topic, I want to see a very well-carved niche. For all top healers, you see one. Holy Paladin has incredible bulk and burst healing. Resto Druid has some extreme flexibility and the hot model on their side. Resto Shaman has such a high amount of utility and group preservation that they feel like two healers put together. Disc has regular absorptions, which are very useful now. Even Holy Priest has a niche that it dies all the time. If someone were to petition for the sake of Monk, which I'm sure many people will try to do in the comments below, I would want to hear what their actual niche is, because as it stands, I don't understand what they are supposed to be the best at in 5-mans, and whatever it is, it certainly does not appear to be very useful. So, that's the tier list. What'd you think? Unlike the DPS tier list, I feel there is very little wiggle room on many of these spots. I had a hard time dealing with Shaman and Priest overall, but not so much that it would have flipped the list on its head like many want to do with other lists. I'm sure people will still be critical of some placements or discussion, but again, I need to remind you that these are just my opinions, and ask that if you're going to share yours, you please do it by using the comparison format I have used. This is about comparing each healer side by side, so if you feel I was unfair to one, you'll have to present why, and you would have to place it and compare it directly to other slots to be fair back. The pinned comment will contain a more detailed breakdown of the different sections of strengths and weaknesses, and this is there to help clear up my thoughts on the specifics of the matter. If you want to discuss a specific slot, please start by breaking things down using that format as well, so I know exactly where your thoughts are on the matter. In the end, I assume we will learn a lot more about healers and their representation at the upcoming Mythic Dungeon Invitational. I worry that this time around you will see even less diversity, but either way, expect to see it all shaken up once BFA is closer to being finished. This will likely be the final healer tier list of the expansion unless something massive changes, but I will be making the tanking tier list next without too much delay. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. Otherwise, thanks for watching and see you guys in the next one.